Now that we have some members in our model, let's take a look at some of our modeling tools that we have to navigate and select and modify and manipulate our model. To start with, let's talk about some of our selection options. Currently, your left click is just the select icon. So if I were to select a member and select another member, it only selects just the one item that I click on. If I hold Shift, you'll see that my left click becomes Select Plus or Select Add. This allows me to hold my Shift key down and add to my current selection. Holding Control allows me to select minus or remove from my current selection. If at any point I want to clear my current selection, I can simply left click in a blank space with nothing to select with just my normal select button, and since nothing is selected, it also clears everything else. I can also right click to restore selection, and also instead of clicking in space, if you were zoomed in fairly close here for some reason and you needed to clear your selections, you can simply right click and use clear selections, and that way nothing is selected. On top of just left clicking with Shift and Control, you can also window, so left click and dragging your mouse while holding your left click button on your mouse will create a window. There are two different types of windows in SDS2. Moving from right to left like this creates a dotted crossing window. Any items that cross the line or are completely within this box are selected. If I make it from left to right over the same area, this is only an included box, so only items completely within this solid box will be selected. You can see that only a few member ends get selected. And I'm sure you've already determined this. The scroll wheel, by zooming in and out, will zoom in and out of your model. One thing to note about your zooming, which may help you navigate, is wherever your mouse is located is where you're going to zoom in and zoom out from. So if I wanted to see a connection on this side, if I put my mouse on it, I don't have to select anything, just zoom in, whatever under my mouse stays under my mouse. So when zooming out, if I wanted to zoom out but keep the model on the upper right here, I would move my mouse into the upper right and zoom out. And that way this area under my mouse stays under my mouse and everything else zooms away. If I wanted to move it to the other side, I would simply go to the other side. This is useful as you're zooming in. If you want to see more in the bottom left down here, put your mouse in the upper right and zoom out, and then you'll see this quicker than if I was zoomed in and I come down here. This never gets any closer. So I want to put it up in the upper right so that I can see this side. Holding Shift, our middle click button becomes rotate. Our rotate is similar to zooming. It'll always be based on where my mouse is at. So if I click off here in space, I have a random point that my mouse is at that it'll rotate around. And it may not rotate as expected as you move your mouse around. So what you can do is make sure your mouse is highlighting an item in your model, and it'll always rotate around that item. For instance, if I hover over this column, hold my Shift key, middle click to rotate, it rotates around that column. If I were to pick this column, you can see that it rotates around that column. So as long as your mouse is highlighting something, your rotations will be much more predictable than if you're just out in space. A common example of this is when you're zoomed in close to a connection like this and you wanted to rotate around this column. If you hold your Shift and middle click out here in space, you're going to rotate, and it's going to be kind of frustrating for you to get this to rotate around because it's not rotating around that column. Instead, if I move my mouse over the column and rotate, I can easily rotate around the column. So those are tips for navigating as far as zooming and rotating to help you navigate your model better. As mentioned in the other videos, the undo view change under my view pull down, or the letter U on my keyboard, will let me go back to previous views. So as I'm rotating around, if I want to go back a few views, I can use the letter U on my keyboard to jump back in views. Control R will go back to the last open view, like was stated in the past video here, which is the last open view or your current view tag here. Another way to modify what is visible in your model is you can select an item and go to your member styles and set it to stick. That way you just see the stick line and you don't see any of the materials if you wanted to look at the holes in the column here, for example. Another option is to simply select the members, and in your right click menu you have the ability to hide members, or you can say hide unselected, which keeps everything you've selected but hides everything else. So if I say hide members, they just simply get hidden and I can see this area without those members in it at all. You have hidden members listed in your model tree here, so you can see that there are members hidden in the view. So if you ever are questioning whether or not a member is hidden for any reason, you can either look in the model tree here, or you can right click and just say show members, and it'll always bring back anything that's hidden. Another way to select items is through your right click menu. So just like zooming in and out, rotating, wherever your mouse is at has items underneath it in the 3D space, even though it's a 2D view. If I right click and say select other, I will have anything under my mouse at the time that I've selected based on my selection filter up here. So at default, I should be able to select anything I have in my view. So you can see that I have the material A7, the member that the material is on, a material W23 for the column, and the column itself. In these select others, I also have the ability to select all B21s, all A7s, and all W23s. This will select all of them at once in my entire model. If I hover over the bolts here and do the same thing, you'll see that I now have holes and also shot bolts that I can select if I want to select them. There's also Edit Other, which gives you the exact same options, but it edits the material or bolts or members versus just selecting them. With the right clicks and the Select Others, it will always add to your selection. So if I say Select Other and select the member, it'll always add to my selection. So Select Other will always add to my selection here. You can use the Shift and Control with your selection windows as well. So if I were to window an area here and I want this over here added, I can hold Shift and window another area and add that selection to it as well. One thing that is useful to be familiar with is the item selected feedback here in the lower left. Currently there is 0 items selected, and so if I just left click on my column here, you can see there's 1 item selected. So if I'm selecting my members here, I can verify that I'm picking what I want to pick by referencing the items selected to make sure that validates with what I'm seeing. Now in these selections there are members, materials, bolts, welds. So if I were to zoom in fairly close here and window this whole area, I get 104 items selected because that's all the angle materials, bolts, holes, ends, members, everything is selected in there. So what I can do to modify exactly what I want to pick is use my selection filter. This selection filter drop-down allows you to pick specific types of items to be able to select in your model. So things like if I wanted just my members, if I window the same area, now I only have 5 items selected. You can see that the members are selected, but the member ends are not, and the bolts are not selected. You can also create a custom by picking specific things. If I wanted just my welds and bolts, I can hold Control and pick just those 2. I can say OK just to run it this time. I can also save that as a named selection filter, which will show up at the top of my selection filter list. If I do that, I can select just my bolts and welds. All I gotta do is set this back to default, and it'll clear my set selection filters. One thing to point out with selection is only items that are visible within the model can be selected. So if I were to set my selection filter to bolts, I can see that if I window this area, I have 24 items selected. If I were to zoom out and make the same window, you can see that 0 items are selected because my bolts are only visible within this range. Once I get out of that range, it turns off the visibility for those members. This is a user option. So under Options, User Site Options, under Modeling, you'll have your level of detail slider. If you slide it to the left, you will always see your solids, no matter how far you zoom out, which can slow your model down. If you slide it to the right for the lowest, you'll have items being hidden sooner, to not take up as much graphics processing. Right in the middle is where we have it by default. So if I slide to the highest and say OK, you can see that even as I slide out here, my bolts are still selectable. So I can still grab those bolts even from out here where it'd be kind of impractical to try to select your bolts. But I can window the entire model here and grab all my bolts now if I needed to, for some reason, change all my bolts and make everything graphical. Let's talk about copying members in your model. So I'm going to go back to my second floor. I'm going to use Control R to revert back to my second floor. And I'm going to talk about copying my columns. So I'm going to select my column here just by left clicking, and then I can go to right click, copy members, or I can go to the model pull down under member and I can say copy. I can either select the members ahead of time or select them after the fact. If I'm selecting them after the fact, I'll select it and right click and say OK, that I'm done picking members, and then I'll get my copy information window. The copy information window allows me to select a single copy, a linear copy, or a fill copy. I also have the ability to mirror image the copy and add an angle of rotation with the copy. Member copy options allows me to set the sequence to a specific sequence or leave it as is. Copy any user piece marks if I manually set a piece mark on this member. I can also allow swapping of member ends if I have mirror image checked on, which helps keep piece marks. I can copy custom properties on this member, and I can copy components, which include connection components and user components. And the member pin options of the new members are all disabled or new auto pins. By default, everything we have is disabled. We want to leave these disabled for this model. So let's take a look at these different copy options. Single copy, if I say OK, will ask me to locate a reference point in my status line here. So I'm going to use my intersection of construction lines. I'm going to locate an intersection, and then I'm going to locate a second point. I'll use my intersection of construction lines, and I'll go ahead and copy this 5 feet to the right. So again, I can type 5-0 and either left click or hit enter, and it'll make a copy of the column to the new location. It's going to ask me to confirm the copy, yes or no. If I say yes, it'll put the column in there. If I say no, it'll go back to my copy command. So I'll say yes, and now it says, do I want to copy any more? I can make more intersections here. One thing to point out here is this is just a change in distance. This is not a where I want to pick from and where I want it to go. So all I have to have is the correct change in distance, change in X, change in Y, change in Z from the original location to pick my points. If I were to right click here, and let's say I run that copy member again here, I'm going to select my column, right click, copy members. We'll do a single copy again. If I need this column to be 8'6" to the right, and I know these 2 points are 8'6", I can just pick those 2 points, and that change in distance in the X direction from the original column location copies it over here 8'6". So you don't have to pick the center of the beam to where you want it to go. You can pick any 2 points for the change in distance on a copy command. So if I left click to say yes, and right click to say I'm done, if I turn them all to solids here, I have 2 more columns here in my model identical to the one I copied. To delete members, I can simply window them and use my delete key and say yes. If I select my column again, right click, copy members, let's talk about our linear copy options. With our linear copy, we have the ability to copy horizontal, vertical, or both. If I copy horizontal, I have the ability for X spacing and number of copies. Number of copies are the additional copies. It does not include the original column or original members selected. So if I say OK, it's going to make 2 copies to the right here at 5-foot spacings. If I were to right click and say copy again, you'll notice that as I'm running my commands, my selection is not getting cleared. The only way to clear a selection is to left click and space. If I just escape out of my commands, my selections stay selected. So escape does not clear selections. I can right click and say copy members, linear, I can say vertical in this case. Let's go 5'0" and number of copies 2. If I left click for yes, you can see that it makes 2 copies vertically in the 5 feet. And then if I run the same copy members and say linear and both, let's go 5 foot in the X, 5 foot in the Y, and 2 copies. You can see that it does an X and a Y and makes a copy, an X and a Y and makes a copy. So this is going to be a linear copy still, but it gives an X and a Y distance for that copy. So again, I can select these, hold my shift key, grab the rest of them, delete those out of there. Again, I can always just SA to turn them back to solid. And if I right click and say copy members, let's do a fill. So a fill gives me both a X spacing and a Y spacing and an X copy and a Y copy. So if I say 5 feet, 5 feet, let's do 2 copies in the X, 2 copies in the Y, and say OK, you'll see that it makes an array, 2 copies in the X, 2 copies in the Y, and it'll fill in that grid. Those are your basic copy commands. If I wanted to mirror with a copy, I could grab my members here. Let's say I want to mirror copy this across the way here over to this point. If I were to right click and say copy members, mirror image, single, say OK. Intersection of construction lines to intersection of construction lines. You can see that it mirrored it across the screen. Mirroring will always mirror horizontally in your current view. So if I right click to return out of that after accepting for it, I can see that I have my mirrored members there. If I needed to mirror it vertically, if I want this mirrored up, what I would do here is grab those members, right click and say copy member, mirror image with a 180 degree rotation. It's going to mirror it and then rotate it 180. If I say OK, then let's go from here, and we'll use auto point just so I can pick a point up here. We'll go 20 feet. You can see that it will mirror it and then flip it. So if I say yes for the copy and right click to say I'm done, you'll see that my 18 by 35s and my 14 by 43 are mirrored correctly. If you've deleted members and you want to bring them back, you have a couple undelete commands. If I go to my model pull down and I go to member, I have undelete, visual undelete, and quick undelete. Quick undelete brings back the last group of members deleted. So if I use quick undelete, that beam and column come back. You'll notice that on these members here, my left end for my 18 by 35 is the same, but in this case, my left end is down here at this member, but up here my left end is at the column that I created. So the left ends will adjust as the copies are made. That swap member ends would allow this left end to be put at the top here and swap the member end so that the piece marking could potentially be the same even though it's mirrored. Now, offhands, things like that will still make it a different piece mark if it's actually different, but this allows it the best possibility of trying to maintain piece marks. So if I wanted to pick a specific item visually, I can go to my model pull down, member, visual undelete, and anything that I have deleted shows up as a model color. Anything that is in my model currently is blue. So if I needed to pick this specific column, I could window that column, right click and say OK, and it brings back that column for me. I can just always delete that when I don't want it, and the same with those. And lastly, the other undelete type is going to be just an undelete, which allows you to select by groups, by member piece marks, or a show all, which shows anything that's been deleted. So currently we've talked about copying members and adding more members and things like that. If I need to edit a member or fix something, again, double clicking on the item here will bring back up the member edit window. Same with a beam. I can always right click and say edit other. And so there's two B21s. If I want to edit both at the same time, I can edit both at the same time. You see the top here says multiple members. I have two B21s selected, and I can make the change of both of them at the same time. You can multi-edit like members by simply windowing them, right-click and say Edit, and it'll edit all the members at once. Anything that is not similar will be in a grayed out field. This does not mean that you cannot type in it, but anything you type in here will change all of them. So if I were to add a different section size in here, like a W12 at 26, it would overwrite that to all of those members and make all of them 12 at 26s. If I want to reset that back to the way it came in, the reset button here just sets it back to the way we first edited those members. I can hit cancel to not make a change. If I have two different member types, like a beam and a column, and I right-click and say Edit, the only thing that is similar between those members are those members' custom properties. So in here I have my custom properties, log, and notes, if I need to apply custom property to everything. Lastly here, if I put a member in the wrong spot, but I don't want to copy it, I want to move it, there is a command called move/stretch which allows us to move those members. So move/stretch can do two things at once. It can move an entire member or just stretch an end of the member if I just have this member end selected. So to demo that, I'm going to come over here to this intersection and I'm going to grab just this member end. So you can see I'm being careful and windowing with a left to right window just around that member end so that only that one item is selected. I can also use my selection filter for member ends, and then it doesn't matter which way I pick, it'll only grab member ends. Now I could grab more member ends if I wanted to, but I'm just going to grab just this one. With just the one member end selected, if I right click and say move stretch members, or under the model pull down, I have member and I have move stretch. Move stretch allows me to locate 2 points just like my copy single does. Just like the copy single, it also does not matter where I start and where I end, it's only picking a change in distance. So if I use intersection of construction lines and I start down here, it's still going to be based off this location to start with. Let's say I go from here and I want to go up 2 feet. You can see that it'll stretch that end 2 feet up, and I can accept yes or no. If I say yes, it'll make that member stretch for me, and now that member no longer frames to the column, it frames to the web of that beam. So within modeling within SDS2, there is no undo for those commands. Once that's done, and I say yes to that confirm, if I want to move it back, I have to move stretch it back to where I want it. So if I grab that member end again, right click and say move stretch members, pick any point, doesn't matter, and let's go 2 feet back the other direction, and either hit enter or left click to locate, and it'll move it back to the column. I can left click to confirm yes, and it'll put it back into place there. If I were to have my selection filter at defaults and I have the entire member selected, or I have both ends selected, it'll move the entire member. It doesn't just stretch one end. So things that can cause it to move versus stretch is if you grab both ends like this, or if you happen to window from right to left and it grabs the end and the entire member, it still has the entire member selected. So if I were to right click and say move stretch members here, and let's just move it 2 feet up, it moves the entire member up. Now it just shifts it over 2 feet, and now it's connected to both beams. So if I were to move stretch the member back down 2 feet, it'll put it back into the column there. So the power of move stretch is it can move and stretch at the same time. So let's say I get a revision back and this entire column line has moved. If I window an included box around just this grid line here, you can see that I have both my members, the entire members, and the ends of the members framing to it all selected. So now if I were to right click and say move stretch members, and let's say intersection of construction lines, let's just go from here, and let's say it moved 6 inches. I can left click and say yes, and it'll reprocess those members 6 inches to the right. It stretches this one longer, stretches this one shorter, and moves everything else the same distance. If I wanted to move my grid line, I can do that as well. If I go to my grid lines, select it, say move grid, I can use any of the points here and say 6 inches to the right, and it'll move it to the right. I'm going to say no, because I want it put back to where it was, and I'm going to move these back. So I'm going to set my selection filter back to default, grab just that area, move stretch, let's just go from the intersection, 6 inches, and left click for yes. And now everything is back into the location where it needs to be. So you can see the power of move stretch at the same time. Lastly, with our modeling window and also our drawing editor window later on here, we can have multiple tiles in our window. So if I were to right click, I can go to tiles and I can say split tile vertically, split tile horizontally. If I had multiple, I have the ability to single tile or remove tile. So if I were to split tile vertically, I have two different tiles here, both of which can be modeled in and rotated from. You'll see that as I highlight in one, it selects in the other. So this allows you to have multiple aspects of the same situation if you needed to. You can have the connection and the member here. Whichever tile my mouse is in, you see there's a blue box here. As I hover over it, that is now the active tile. So if I were to right click and say set active, it turns red, which means this is always my active tile now regardless of where my mouse goes. If I were to right click and say clear active tile, then it goes back to where my mouse jumps to. The reason for this is if you were trying to measure a specific point, let's say if I measured from my member ends, we'll talk more about exact point later, from here to here, you'll see that I've picked my points in my model, but using two different views. If I have it set to where this is my active tile and it doesn't follow my mouse, this is the only view I can pick points in. So if I were to measure again and try to pick over here, you can see that as I left click, I cannot actually pick this point anymore. So I would have to pick it over here in the active view. One thing to point out as well is if I do not have an active view, but I were to come up and set my depth check, as long as my cursors are in my in and out field here, my view is locked. I cannot go to a different active view. So until I tab out of those fields, I will not be able to change it back to having it follow my mouse. And that is because each view can have its own depth check set. Whichever view is my active tile is also the view that other commands will run in, like open view. So if I were to have my mouse in this view and hit Control O for open view, I can change this to like one of my grid lines here, and I can have this view in one and this view in the other. You can click and drag these if I want this to be smaller, and you can keep splitting these if you want to. So I split this horizontally. Now I have 3 tiles here. These tiles will be saved to your user options as you close out and relaunch modeling. If you ever want to go back to a single tile, simply right click and say tiles and go single tile, and it'll clear the rest of the tiles and just leave the one that your mouse was active in when you set it to single tile. One thing to note about the tiles, your member styles affect all views. You cannot have different member styles in different views because the member style is applying to the entire model. Your views are just looking at it in different views. So as long as your members are in solid, every view that can see that member will see it in that solid. Last few things about the modeling tiles are there are some preset configurations for your modeling tiles. If you go to your view pull down under tiles, you have the same split, set active, clear active. There's also a toggle active with the shortcut of TT, which we'll show in just a second. There's also some predefined tiles. So there's 3 left, 3 right, 3 top, 3 bottom, 4. There's 2 vertical, 2 horizontal, 1. So if I were to say 3 left, it go ahead and puts it into this configuration with 2 on the right and 1 on the left. So instead of right clicking and saying set active, I can use TT to toggle the one I'm currently in active, and it'll toggle them active and non-active. Another thing you can do if you have your rulers shown on your modeling view is in this blue area here. You can simply click and it'll make it active that way. At any point I can either right click and say single tile, or under view tiles I can just say 1 and it goes back to a single tile. Lastly, just some basic display options here. If I go to my display options, some common options that customers will turn on is the member ends always displayed. If I uncheck that and say OK, you'll notice that now my red boxes here are not displayed unless I actually select them specifically. So some customers do not like the boxes always being displayed. Some prefer them always displayed. That's just a display option here to member ends always displayed. You can turn off your member piece marks and member numbers and just section sizes or just member lines. We're going to leave piece marks and our section sizes on. If I turn off member numbers and say apply and OK, you'll see that it just has a piece mark and no longer a member number there. Another thing in your display options, annotation text scale and your actual scale of the drawing. So if I were to change the scale of this view, this is the scale that the view will initially be detailed in Drawing Editor if I were to save over this view. So currently it's at 0.125 to 12 or a 1/8 to 12. If I want to make this a 1/4 to 12, make it a bigger view or bigger scale, I would say 0.5 and say OK. And you can see that everything else as far as the member labels gets smaller. So this just makes the piece marks look a little smaller because of this change in scale. If I were to save this for any reason, it would save this second floor with this new orientation and a different scale. So if I were to Control R right now without saving to open back up my second floor again and go back into my display options, you'll see this is back to 0.125 because I did not save that. If I were to go to 0.25, say OK, and then use my Save View As and save over my second floor, if I were to reopen my second floor again and go to my display options, now it's saved as 0.25. Once this view has been detailed through detail erection views, this no longer affects the scale of the detail view. You can change that scale directly on the drawing. But until it's detailed, this will be the default scale then for when it's detailed. Your annotation text scale, you'll notice that as you're picking points or measuring, you have your 25 feet there. That scale of that label is driven by the annotation text scale. So if I want it a little bit smaller, you can see now that it's a smaller distance when I measure my 2 points here. This is quite a little bit smaller there. I can also toggle that on and off if I don't want to see that at all. I won't see it at all if I toggle it off here. Our next phase will be some more modeling here and finishing out our model so that we can get into some of our connection design, material, and detailing items later on.